The blood draw took 11 seconds. Corporal Marin Vaz had timed it herself. She always did, ever since her first posting on Relay Station Duvark, where the medic had a habit of leaving the needle in 3 seconds longer than necessary and calling it thoroughness. 11 seconds. The auto-injector clicked, the sample vial filled amberdark, and the station's biometric system hummed its familiar 4-note chord that meant processing had begun. She pulled her sleeve down and looked at the ceiling. Around her, 11 other soldiers did the same, rolling shoulders, checking wristbands, trading the bored half-smiles of people who had been through this ritual enough times that it no longer registered as anything except an interruption. The Vithrani coalition required quarterly blood samples from all human personnel stationed above the fourth ring. It was in the treaty, Article 7, Subclause 9, the part that the diplomats referred to as biological transparency protocols, and that the enlisted referred to as the Pocan Pri. 3 years into the coalition's joint military program, and Marin had donated enough blood to fill a small bathtub. She didn't mind the needle. She'd never had a problem with needles. It was the waiting she disliked, the particular quality of stillness required while someone else's machine decided things about your body. She endured it by counting. The 4 notes of the processing chord, the 11 seconds, the 12 personnel in the room, the 3 exits. The 6 ceiling panels, 2 of them slightly off-center, which she had mentally catalogued and mentally corrected in her head 100 times now, which never stopped bothering her. Private Hawks was lacing her boot in the way she always laced her boot, left eyelet over right, which was backwards from standard-issue training, and which Hawks had been told about on at least 4 occasions that Marin had witnessed. She did it anyway. People's small stubbornnesses were usually the most interesting thing about them. The hum changed pitch. It wasn't a dramatic change. It wasn't the kind of thing that made anyone reach for a weapon or snap to their feet. It was subtle, a half-step lower, a stuttering quality, like a machine catching a splinter in its gears. Marin noticed it the way you notice a silence that replaces a sound you didn't know you'd been listening to. She glanced at the processing terminal. The screen had gone dark. Sergeant Olin Price looked up from his phone. That happened before. No, the medic, a thin Vithrani named Sewell, the one who always wore the same expression of professional disinterest, was staring at the terminal with an expression that was not professional disinterest. Marin had never seen Sewell's face do what it was doing now. It looked, for a moment, like fear. Then it looked like something worse than fear. It looked like recognition. Sewell, Price put his phone away. What's the error? The Vithrani medic pressed 2 fingers to his throat, the gesture his kind used when they needed a moment to compose themselves, equivalent to a human closing their eyes and breathing through the nose. Marin had learned the gesture in orientation. She had also learned that it was considered mildly intimate to perform it in front of strangers, a concession of vulnerability, and she had only ever seen Vithrani do it when they were alone or among people they trusted. She had never seen Sewell do it at all. "I need to run a verification," he said. "Please wait." "We've got PT in 20 minutes, said Private Hawks from the far bench, not looking up from lacing her boot. "Please wait," Sewell said again. Marin watched him. She was good at watching people. It was the thing she was best at and the thing that had gotten her assigned to this joint posting in the first place. Her file said interpersonal acuity, exceptional. What it meant was that she noticed things, small things, the ways people held themselves when they were performing calm they didn't feel, the hesitations before words that should have come easily, the hands that moved wrong. Right now she noticed that Sewell's fingers pressing against his throat were trembling. She stood up. "Sit down, Vaz," Price said automatically. "Something's wrong with the terminal, Sergeant." "Sewell's handling it." Sewell scared. That got everyone's attention. 11 heads came up. Hawks's boot stayed half-laced. Sewell, to his credit, didn't deny it. He turned from the terminal and looked at Marin with those wide amber eyes that always made Vithrani expressions so readable once you knew how to look. The eyes were the whole face, for Vithrani. Everything else was too still, too controlled, but the eyes gave everything. "The system has flagged a sample," he said. "Mine." Then, after a pause that felt like swallowing something, "Yours." The Vithrani coalition occupied a loose cluster of 43 star systems along the arm of the galaxy humans had taken to calling the corridor, mostly because it was the only direction they were allowed to travel without asking permission first. The coalition was not hostile. The coalition was, by its own accounting, deeply benevolent, and it had the fleet size to prove it. When humans had first blistered past the heliopause in their rattling, over-engineered ships, the coalition had been watching. They had evaluated. They had calculated, with a patience built from 11,000 years of first contact protocols, and then they had extended what they called the Rethaval, an invitation to partnership, issued to species of sufficient potential. Most species received the Rethaval after 200 years of evaluation. Humanity had received it after 47. This was the thing the coalition mentioned at every official function, every joint briefing, every ceremony where they handed humans some new piece of technology or access to some new corridor of space. 47 years, an honor without precedent. Humanity was remarkable. Humanity was extraordinary. Humanity was, in the coalition's considered judgment, the most fascinating species encountered in 11,000 years of stellar cartography. Marin had heard this speech so many times she could recite it in her sleep, and she had, on at least 2 occasions, been told she was muttering it during PT. What she had never understood, what no one had bothered to explain, was why. She had asked once early in her first posting. Asked the cultural liaison assigned to the joint unit, a Vithrani named Sev who had a habit of answering every question with a longer question, and who had responded to, "Why 47 years specifically?" with, "What is it about your species that you believe makes speed a measure of worth?" Marin had thought about that for 3 weeks and concluded that the answer was probably something like capitalism and sports, and that Sev probably knew that. The joint posting existed at the intersection of 2 questions humanity had stopped asking because the answers never came. Why us, and why now? The coalition science teams ran their tests, took their samples, logged their readings, and filed their reports, and every quarter the biometric terminal hummed its 4-note chord, and the samples went somewhere, and no one mentioned them again. Until now. The room they brought her to was not a medical room. It was not a debrief room. It was not any of the rooms she had a name for, in the part of the station where human personnel were allowed to go. It was deeper in, through a corridor that Marin had always clocked as a maintenance passage, behind a door that required Sewell's biometric signature, and then a second signature from someone she had never met, a tall Vithrani in a collar rank she didn't recognize, who said nothing and stepped aside and didn't follow them in. Price came with her. The rest stayed behind with Hawks, who was by then fully laced and no happier about it. The room had no chairs. The Vithrani didn't use chairs. Their anatomy was wrong for it. All hip angle and weighted counterbalance. Something in the lower back that made sustained sitting painful in a way that no amount of ergonomic adjustment had ever successfully addressed. Marin knew this from a 7-page brief she had read 3 years ago, and from the evidence of her own eyes. She had never, in 3 years of joint postings, seen a Vithrani sit. There was a low platform in the center of the room, probably intended for human guests, and a series of data screens on the walls. And standing before the screens was a Vithrani who was old in a way that even Marin could read without any particular cultural training. The skin around the eyes grown pale, the amber faded toward gold, the posture that of something that had been carrying weight for a very long time and had stopped expecting to put it down. "Corporal Vaz," the old Vithrani said, "my name is Orvith. I am the Coalition's senior archivist for the Rethaval records. I don't know what that means, Marin said. I know. Orvith moved to the nearest screen and brought up a display that meant nothing to Marin, lines and patterns, and nested geometric shapes that pulsed slowly in colors she didn't have names for, some of them outside the human visible spectrum, and rendered in approximation by the display system. The Rethaval records are the biological archive of every species that has ever received an invitation to partnership. 41 species over 11,000 years. A pause. Some of those species no longer exist. Price made a sound that wasn't quite a word. The evaluation process, Orvith continued, is more complex than we have disclosed. The partnership invitation is not issued to species alone. It is issued to genetic lines, specific bloodlines that our archive identifies as carrying what we call the Rethaval marker. A marker we have tracked across species, across millennia, because it consistently produces individuals of exceptional. He stopped, searching for the word with the careful deliberateness of someone who knows 40 languages and is choosing precisely between them. Consequence. Marin looked at the screen. The nested geometric shapes pulsed slowly like something breathing. You've been running a lineage scan, she said, every quarter on our blood. Yes. For 3 years. For 47 years on every human biological sample we could obtain through legitimate channels, station medicals, refugee processing, pre-coalition contact through means that were less transparent. The old archivist pressed his fingers to his throat, but the gesture looked different than Sewell's had. Less fear, more something like grief, the gesture of someone confessing rather than composing. We were looking for a line we believed to be extinct. The room was very quiet. We found it this morning, Orvith said. The Vaz family, as far as Marin knew, was from Bratislava, 3 generations back on her mother's side, and from somewhere in the broken middle of what had been Pakistan before the border redraw on her father's. They were not remarkable people. Her grandmother had repaired solar panels on the rooftop arrays in the Danube corridor. Her grandfather had driven a water truck in the desert settlements, which was the kind of job that required a person to be trusted with something essential and irreplaceable. And he had been trusted, and he had done it, and he had never spoken of it as anything other than work. Her mother taught secondary school mathematics in a city that had been rebuilt twice, and was on its 3rd flag. She was calm in the way that people who love certainty are calm. She had found the one true language, the one that meant the same thing in every country and every century, and she had chosen to live inside it. Marin had always loved and resented that about her in equal measure. Mathematics didn't leave room for reading people. It didn't care about the half-second pause before a word, or the way hands moved wrong. Her father had been a corporal too, in a different army, a different posting, a war that was smaller but felt larger to the people in it. He had come home from it in the way soldiers sometimes came home, not all at once, but in pieces, a little less of himself present each time he walked through the door, until the version of him that returned was so thin it barely cast a shadow, and eventually that version stopped returning too. 9 years. She had done the math on it, as her mother would have, as a calculation rather than a wound. 40% of her life without the particular specific weight of him, and the absence still had a shape. She had enlisted because the army gave you a reason to be somewhere. It was not a romantic reason. It was not even a very good reason in the abstract. But it was the only one she had at 19, and it had turned out to be enough. She sat in the room with no chairs, on the edge of the low platform, and listened to Orvith explain what she was. The Rethaval marker, he said, had first been identified 47,000 years ago, in a species the Coalition called the Vale, a civilization that had risen and collapsed before humans had mastered fire, before humans had mastered anything, in the long blank before the species became a species in any meaningful sense. The Vale had built something close to what humans might call an empire, stretching across 30 systems, and they had done it through a combination of adaptability and social cohesion that the coalition's researchers had been attempting to replicate and understand ever since. Not through force, the Veil were not a warlike people. Not through economic dominance, they had no currency that the coalition's economists could reconstruct. Through something less quantifiable. Through the capacity to hold different things in relationship, to see where the gaps were and fill them, to notice what others missed and name it without the naming becoming a weapon. Their collapse had not been dramatic. Empires rarely fell the way stories said they did in Fire and Conquest, in the clean narrative arc of a decisive battle. The Veil had simply become less over generations. The things they had been good at, the integration, the connection, the gap reading, had become institutionalized, and then bureaucratized, and then performed rather than practiced, and then forgotten. A civilization that had built its coherence on genuine human, or Veil, contact had gradually replaced that contact with protocols. And protocols, it turned out, were a very poor substitute for actually paying attention. The last of their bloodline had scattered into other species through the slow intercourse of contact and cohabitation and time. The Veil had been hospitable people. They had welcomed visitors. Their genetics had moved outward through the slow drift of biology, carrying the marker without knowing it, passing it on in a chain so diffuse that the coalition's trackers had followed it across 8 different species before losing it entirely, 11,000 years ago. Or so they had believed. The marker is dominant, Orvith said, but it requires a specific confluence to express fully. The genetic inheritance from both parents must carry the recessive component for the dominant expression to activate. This is why it is so rare. It is not enough to carry it from one side. He brought up a new display, 2 lines of genetic notation, branching and converging. Your mother's line, your father's line. The probability of their combination producing a full expression was, he glanced at the screen, approximately 1 in 400 billion. Price laughed. It was not a happy laugh. It was the laugh of someone who has been told something that is too large to receive without making a sound. The entire time we've been taking those blood tests. We were looking for this, Orvith said. Yes. For 47 years. Yes. Every human blood sample your people could get their hands on. Yes. Orvith's voice was steady. It was the steadiness of someone who had rehearsed the confession many times. We are aware that this constitutes a significant breach of the transparency we have represented to your species. The full council has authorized the disclosure. We are prepared to discuss the formal response at whatever level your government requires. A pause. But we believed the present circumstance warranted telling you first. Marin had not spoken during this exchange. She was looking at her hands at the inside of her left arm, where the needle mark was already fading. She was thinking about her father, who had driven his water truck and carried something in his blood that he never knew was there, and who had passed it to a daughter he eventually stopped coming home to. She was thinking about the way genetics worked, the accidental intersection of 2 people who hadn't known each other long and hadn't stayed together, and the thing that confluence had produced, apparently, was her. What does it mean, she asked, the marker? What does it actually do? Orvith was quiet for a moment. In the Veil it produced what they called leaders, but that word translates poorly. Not commanders, not strategists, not the people who gave orders or made plans, something closer to what you might call connectors. Individuals who could integrate systems, people, technologies, competing loyalties, mismatched needs. They saw the place where things failed to communicate and they fixed it, not through authority. Through presence and attention, and the Veil word translates roughly as the one who makes the team function. Not the best member of the team, the one without whom the team is not a team. Marin looked at her hands for a long time. You were assigned to this joint posting, Orvith continued, not because your file cited interpersonal acuity. Every posting recommendation we make to your military goes through our cultural liaison. We recommended you on the basis of a genetic marker you found in a blood sample, on the basis of behavioral data consistent with ethaval expression, supported by the genetic confirmation. The quiet in the room was a different kind of quiet now. "We have been waiting," the archivist said, "for you." Here is where the story, a different version of itself would have told, would pivot to awe, to the weight of ancient destiny settling onto Reddy's shoulders, to a soldier discovering her purpose and rising to meet it in the way that chosen people in stories always rise, with the gravity of someone who has suspected, on some level, that they were always meant for something larger. That is not what happened. What happened was that Marin said, "I need to think," walked out of the room with no chairs, found a maintenance corridor 2 junctions down, sat on the floor with her back against the cold wall and her knees drawn up, and stayed there for 40 minutes while Price stood at the far end of the passage and didn't push, which was the thing she valued most about him. She was angry. She spent about 10 minutes with the anger, because it was real and it deserved its time. The anger at 47 years of covert biological surveillance dressed up as transparency protocols. The anger at being maneuvered into a posting without being told why. The anger at whatever ancestral accident had made her a variable in a plan she hadn't consented to. She let the anger be exactly the size it was, and then she let it exhaust itself, because anger required decisions to stay alive, and she wasn't ready to make those yet. Then she thought about her unit. She thought about Private Hawks, who was lacing her boot backwards when all of this started, and who had a laugh that could fill an entire mess hall, and who panicked under pressure in a very specific way. Too many words, too fast, running ahead of the situation, until someone gave her a concrete task to anchor to, at which point she became one of the most reliable people Marin had ever served with. She thought about Sergeant Price, who was standing at the end of this corridor right now, giving her space because he understood that sometimes space was the thing needed, but who also defaulted to authority when he was scared because authority was the tool he trusted most, and because being scared was something he had never fully learned to admit. She thought about how many decisions she'd seen him make in the last 3 years, good decisions, careful decisions, that had been made 2 degrees off because of something he wasn't letting himself know. She thought about the rest of them, the 11 in the medical bay, the 42 on the station, the 160 across the broader joint program. She thought about every friction she'd ever witnessed between humans and Vithrani, the misread signals, the accidentally insulting gestures, the meetings that ran 3 hours past their scheduled end because both sides were trying to agree and each was agreeing to something slightly different and no one had noticed yet. She thought about how much of that friction was genuine incompatibility and how much of it was just failure to pay attention, failure to ask, failure to create the conditions where the asking was safe. She thought about what Orvith had called her, the one who makes the team function. She thought about whether she believed in destiny. She didn't particularly. Destiny required a kind of faith in external direction that she had never quite managed, possibly because she'd spent too many years reading rooms and watching what people actually did rather than what they were supposed to do. She believed in patterns. She believed in the accumulated evidence of choices made and habits formed. She believed that you could look at a person and understand, over time, what they were built for, not because it had been written in their blood before they were born, but because they kept returning to it, kept gravitating toward the problem that matched the shape of their particular attention. She had always been able to see the gaps. She had always been able to name them in ways that didn't escalate. She had always been the person who ended up at the seam of 2 things that weren't communicating and started the translation. She stood up. "Price," she said, "I need to talk to Orvith again." "Figured," he said. "And then I need to talk to Admiral Chen." A pause. About what? About what we've been doing wrong, she said. The Vithrani corridor, as it turned out, was in crisis. This was not information that humans in the joint program had been given directly. It was the kind of information that leaked in pieces through the seams of classified briefings. A word here, a tonal shift there, the way certain Vithrani officers had been looking at their communications terminals with an expression that Marin now understood was not routine technical attention. She had been clocking it for 6 months. She had filed it in the part of her mind where she put things she didn't have enough context to interpret and left them to wait. Now she had the context. There was a faction within the coalition called the Vithari Regressives. Marin's file on them was thin, 3 paragraphs, heavily redacted, the kind of document that existed to acknowledge the existence of a thing without actually describing it. What she'd pieced together from the seams and the silences was this. The regressives believed the Rethaval was a mistake, that bringing younger species into the coalition diluted the integrity of the whole, that the entire 11,000-year project of interspecies partnership was a noble idea that had, in practice, produced more friction than connection, and that the coalition would function more cleanly, more effectively, and more ethically without the complications introduced by species who were still, to use the regressive framing, becoming. Humanity in particular was too volatile, too short-lived, too recently emerged from its own particular mud, to be trusted with access to the corridor and the technologies and the relationships that came with it. They had been a minority faction, vocal but contained, for most of the 47 years of partnership. In the last 14 months, they had stopped being a minority. Orvith told her the rest of it in the room with no chairs, this time with Admiral Chen present and 3 of the coalition's senior command staff, none of whom Marin had ever met, and all of whom looked at her with the particular expression of people who have been told something about you that you don't yet know yourself. The regressives had been systematically undermining joint operations for the past year. Small failures, supply routes that arrived with components missing, communications that arrived scrambled in ways that looked like technical error, training exercises that ended in what were logged as accidents but which, when you laid the incident reports side by side, showed a pattern of timing and targeting that accidents didn't produce. Nothing that could be definitively attributed. Nothing that couldn't be explained by the ordinary friction of cross-species logistics and the inevitable imprecision of operating at scale. But the pattern was there for someone who knew how to see it, and Orvith had seen it, and now Marin could see it too. "They're not trying to start a war," she said. "No," said the senior coalition commander, a tall Vithrani named Vethkalo, whose rank collar was so heavy it seemed to bow her neck, and whose eyes were the oldest amber Marin had ever seen, so far toward gold they were almost amberless. "They are trying to prove that the partnership cannot function, that humans and Vithrani are incompatible at a fundamental level, that whatever potential humanity showed in those first 47 years of evaluation was not, in practice, translating into anything that justifies the cost. And if they can prove that, the Rethaval can be revoked. Article 14. If a species cannot integrate, cannot demonstrate the foundational cohesion required for full partnership status, the invitation is withdrawn. The partnership ends." Vethkalo pressed her fingers to her throat, not in hostility, in administrative conclusion. That is how the regressives have framed it, not as an act of aggression, as a matter of institutional hygiene. Admiral Chen was looking at Marin with an expression she recognized as the expression senior officers developed when they were deciding how much to trust something they didn't fully understand and couldn't fully control. It was a familiar expression. She'd spent most of her career being on the receiving end of it. "The archive records," Orvith said quietly, "indicate that when the Veil faced internal fracturing, when factions within the 30-system empire began to argue that the whole was too complex, too diverse, too frictionful to maintain. It was resolved by a specific process, not by force, not by politics, not by any intervention from above, by the ethival demonstrating the integration point, making the connection visible, showing both sides the place where they were, in fact, already joined without knowing it, not arguing that they should be joined, showing them that they already were. He looked at Marin. "I'm a corporal," she said. "Yes," said Orvith. "I have no diplomatic authority, no rank that means anything above this posting. No access to the regressive faction or the senior coalition council. I can't present evidence or make arguments or influence a vote." "No," said Orvith. "So what exactly are you suggesting?" The old archivist looked at her for a long moment. The gold in his eyes was the color of something very old that had seen many things reach their conclusions. "I am not suggesting anything. The ethival does not receive assignments. The role cannot be directed or delegated or planned. It is exercised through contact, through being in proximity to the fracture, through occupying the space where the two things that don't communicate are failing to communicate, and being the kind of person who notices that and does something about it." He pressed his fingers to his throat. "You need to be in the right room. That is the only thing I can tell you." The right room was a convoy. Not metaphorically. An actual convoy, 6 transports, 3 Vithrani escort vessels, carrying joint personnel and equipment through the corridor's inner ring to a station called Duvark Tertius, where the coalition's annual integration review was scheduled in 11 days. The review was where the regressive faction planned to make their formal move, to present their accumulated evidence of human Vithrani incompatibility to the coalition's full council, and begin the proceedings for Rethaval revocation. The convoy was also where Orvith had intelligence suggesting the regressives planned to create one final, definitive incident, something that couldn't be explained away, something that would happen in front of witnesses, on record, with timestamps and formal documentation, that would demonstrate with unmistakable clarity that humans and Vithrani could not be trusted to operate together without catastrophe. The incident's specific form was unknown. Its intent was not. Marin was assigned to Transport 3 through standard rotation. She was not assigned there by Orvith or by any intervention. The rotation was genuine. There were 43 other joint personnel on Transport 3, human and Vithrani mixed, in the proportions that the joint program's integration protocols specified, and none of them knew what she knew. She had 11 days. She started with what she had, which was what she always started with, what she could see. The friction in Transport 3 was not dramatic. It was the ordinary friction of mixed species close quarters, the kind that accumulated in invisible layers, like sediment, until suddenly you were standing at the bottom of something that had been building for months, and you had no idea how you got there. There was Lieutenant Dave Caro, human, 29, who had been on joint postings for 2 years, and who had developed the habit of speaking to Vithrani colleagues in simplified sentences, slowly and with careful enunciation, because she had been told once. In an orientation session she had attended and forgotten the details of that the translation matrices struggled with complex syntax. The Vithrani she worked with most closely, a logistics specialist named Seth Navon, who was approximately 240 years old and had been coordinating multi-species supply chains since before Caro's grandparents were born, had been fluent in 17 human languages since his early career, and found the slow, simple sentences somewhere between insulting and exhausting. He had never said this, because his experience with human officers suggested that corrections were received as attacks and attacks produced defensive escalation, and he had learned over a century of working with younger species that the exhaustion was more manageable than the escalation. So he said nothing, and Caro continued. And the relationship between them had calcified into a surface professional courtesy that concealed, from Caro's side, well-intentioned condescension. And from Navon's side, 2 years of suppressed frustration that had nowhere to go and so had simply settled into the architecture of how he held himself around her. There was the mess hall issue, the way the humans clustered at the warmer end and the Vithrani gravitated to the cooler end, not through policy or preference or anything anyone had decided, but through the accumulated drift of small daily choices. The heating element on the port side of the mess clanged when it ran, which humans found irritating but tolerable and Vithrani found deeply uncomfortable. Their secondary auditory apparatus was calibrated for a wider frequency range, and the irregular pitch of a clanging heating element landed somewhere between mildly unpleasant and physically distracting. Nobody had told the humans this. The humans had watched the Vithrani cluster at the far end for 3 weeks and had begun, unconsciously, to read it as preference for separation. The Vithrani had watched the humans cluster near the clanging thing and had concluded that humans were indifferent to sensory discomfort in a way that was simply a species difference and not worth mentioning. 2 groups dividing a room, each convinced the other was choosing the division. There was Specialist Garo, human, whose coping mechanism under stress was humor, specifically the kind of humor that required shared cultural context. Jokes about Earth football, jokes about ancient pre-contact films, the ones in the 21st century archive that everyone on any human posting had seen at least twice. Jokes that required you to know what a specific expression or line or moment meant before you could understand why it was funny. These jokes landed perfectly with the humans on board and fell into absolute silence with the Vithrani, and Garo had started to read that silence as dislike rather than the simple unfamiliarity it actually was, and was responding to it by getting quieter and more withdrawn, which the Vithrani were reading as hostility, which was making them more formal, which was making him more withdrawn. And there was the thing underneath all of it. The Vithrani personnel knew something was wrong with this convoy mission, not its purpose, that was classified at a level none of them had clearance for, but its texture. The way the pre-departure briefing had been conducted with an attention that wasn't normal for a routine supply run. The way the escort vessels had been configured. The way Veth Kahlo herself, the senior commander, was present on Transport 3, which was not the ship a commander of that rank occupied on a standard logistics convoy. Something was coming. They could feel the shape of it without knowing its form. Orveth's warning about the regressives had filtered down through the Vithrani chain of information in the way that things filtered down, imperfectly, in pieces, through the lateral channels of a species that had been managing institutional knowledge for 11,000 years and had very particular ideas about what circulated and how. The humans didn't know any of this. The humans felt the tension. It was impossible not to feel a quality in the air of the Vithrani around them that was tighter than usual, more watchful, the amber eyes tracking more carefully, the pauses before answers a half-beat longer, and they were reading it as hostility, as something they had done, or were doing, or represented, that was causing the Vithrani around them to become guarded and formal and careful. 2 groups, each reading the other's fear as aggression, each pulling back in response to what was actually the other pulling back. The feedback loop of ordinary human-to-alien contact, self-reinforcing, accelerating toward the kind of atmosphere in which a sabotage operation could be counted on to produce exactly the fracture it intended. Marin watched it for 3 days. Then she started pulling threads. She started with Seth Navon. Not because he was the most important, but because he was the most useful and the most frustrated, and people who are frustrated are honest in ways that contented people rarely are. Their defenses are working so hard on the frustration that they don't have resources left for the performance of fine. She found him in the equipment bay on day 4, running inventory checks on a crate of navigational components, moving through the manifest with the brisk efficiency of someone who has done this 10,000 times and stopped finding it interesting approximately 9,000 times ago. She asked if she could help. He looked at her with an expression that translated, she was fairly certain as, "Why would you want to?" "I like inventory," she said. "It's calming." "It is not calming," he said. "It is tedious." "It's calming for me, counting things, checking them off. I sleep better after I've done an inventory, something about knowing where everything is." He studied her for a moment. The Vithrani tell for assessment was a slight narrowing of the upper lid, almost imperceptible, and then handed her a scanner without comment. They worked in silence for 10 minutes, which was a good 10 minutes, the kind of silence that had companionship in it rather than absence. Then he said, without looking up from his own screen, "Your Lieutenant Caro believes I struggle with complex language. I know. She speaks to me as though I am learning to speak for the first time. I know that too." Marin finished a line on her manifest and moved to the next crate. "She's not trying to be dismissive. She's trying to be considerate. She attended an orientation session 3 years ago that told her something inaccurate, and she's been acting on it ever since because nobody corrected it. She is working from an assumption she has never questioned." He set down his scanner and looked at her directly, which in Vithrani interaction meant full attention, all other processing deprioritized, all eyes. "Why are you telling me this instead of her?" "Because you know it already, and I needed to know if you were willing to have the conversation with her. She doesn't know. She can't correct for something she doesn't know, but you know and you could tell her." A long pause, the hum of the ship around them, a distant clanging that was, Marin noted, the heating element in the mess hall, audible even at this distance, something she filed for later. "What would I say?" he asked. "The truth, that you find the simplified sentences difficult to receive, not as an accusation, just as information, without the accumulated weight of 2 years of frustration behind it, just the fact of it. She doesn't need the history. She needs to know the thing she's doing and the effect it has." He was quiet for a long time. "What does this have to do with anything?" he asked finally. "On this transport, in this mission?" Marin set down her scanner. She looked around the equipment bay, at the crates, at the navigational components, at the walls of the ship carrying all of them through a corridor between systems. "You feel something is wrong on this transport?" It was not a question. His posture changed slightly, the Vithrani equivalent of a flinch. "We all do," she said. "Your side and mine. For different reasons, but the result is the same. We're both scared of something that hasn't happened yet, and we're reading that fear off each other and thinking it's aimed at us. Thinking the other side is the problem." She picked up her scanner again. "Whatever is coming from outside, we can't do much about it right now. But what we can do is fix what's broken in here, so that when it comes, we're not 2 groups pulling in opposite directions. We're one crew." He was still for a moment, then he picked up his scanner. "I will speak to Lieutenant Caro," he said. She talked to Garo next, not about stopping the jokes, but about the context, about how humor worked as a bridge when the references were shared and became a wall when they weren't, and about the fact that the Vithrani who'd been going silent weren't dismissing him. They were waiting for a way in that the jokes didn't provide. "Give them the door," she said. "You don't have to stop. Just leave the door open." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has been told something simple that they needed to hear and was deciding whether to be relieved or embarrassed about that, and then he nodded. She talked to Palos, the Vithrani engineer, who had been sitting at the far end of the mess for 3 weeks because the warm side of the room made her auditory apparatus ache, and who had assumed that clustering with the other Vithrani was the polite thing to do, that it respected the human need for their own space, and who had no idea at all that the humans were reading it as a deliberate choice to separate. She told Palos about the heating element. Palos looked at her with the wide-eyed expression that meant something genuinely new had entered Vithrani awareness, and said, very quietly, "I thought they preferred the sound." She talked to Caro, who went defensive first, a quick flush, and a set of the jaw that Marin recognized as the reflex of someone who takes competence seriously and has been told they've been incompetent. Marin let her be defensive for 30 seconds, which was usually enough. Then Caro went to horrified. Then she went to quiet. And then she came back to Marin the following morning with a list. The list was long. It was organized into categories. Caro had a mathematical mind. "This is every assumption I could identify that I've never questioned," she said. "On this posting, about working with Vithrani. How many of these are wrong?" Marin looked at the list. "I don't know, but I know who to ask." The mess hall shifted. Not overnight, nothing real happened overnight, but it shifted day by day in the way things shift when the conditions change. Palos moved to a middle table on day 5. She moved because she now knew that her absence was being misread, and because Marin had fixed the heating element. It had taken 20 minutes with a torque wrench and a recalibration of the thermal output valve, and the clanging stopped, and the warm side of the room became somewhere a Vithrani could sit without their secondary auditory apparatus protesting. Because Palos moved, 2 other Vithrani moved, because Palos was well regarded and where she went carried meaning. Because the middle tables had people in them, others stopped treating them as no man's land and started occupying them too. Within 4 days, the room had stopped looking like 2 armed camps sharing a cafeteria and started looking, tentatively, like a crew. Garo started explaining his jokes, not in the labored, heavy way of someone who has been told to be more inclusive. He was better at his own material than that. He started leaving the context in. A line from an old film, and then, offhandedly, "It's from this ancient comedy. The premise is that," and the Vithrani who were nearby would hear the premise, and sometimes, not always but sometimes, the joke would land differently. The Vithrani, it turned out, had equivalents. Different reference points, wildly different rhythms, some of them so conceptually foreign that Garo needed 5 minutes of collaborative translation to even understand what was supposed to be funny. But the same impulse, the need to share something familiar with people who are far from everything familiar. The mess hall started to be loud in a way it hadn't been before. Caro had a long conversation with Navon in the logistics bay. Marin did not hear it. She was not there. She did not need to be. She saw them afterward, both of them with the slightly lighter look of people who have put down something they didn't know they were carrying. Marin was not the one who did any of this. That was the part that took her a while to understand clearly. She pointed. She connected. She named the gap and then stepped back and let the people on either side of it do what they had, in fact, always been capable of doing if the gap had been visible. The work was not in her. It had never been in her. It had been in them, waiting. On day 6, she found Price sitting with Veth Kahlo in the transport's small observation deck, looking at the stars through the hexagonal port window, speaking in voices too quiet to hear. The conversation looked unhurried. She didn't interrupt. On day 7, she found Seth Navon and Lieutenant Caro in the equipment bay, running inventory together. The silence between them was the good kind. On day 8, the incident started. It came through the convoy's communications array at 3:40 station time. A distress signal, the Vithrani standard frequency, fully authenticated, registered as originating from one of the escort vessels. The alert woke the communications room and cascaded through the overnight duty rosters, the kind of signal that required immediate response because the Vithrani standard distress protocol mandated that any authenticated signal be treated as genuine until proven otherwise. A rule written after a catastrophe that Marin had read about in the coalition history briefs. A catastrophe that had happened because someone had decided not to respond until they were sure. Marin was awake because she'd been awake since 200, which was something she didn't tell people about and which had been true her whole life. Something in her body that refused to fully commit to sleep past a certain hour, that pulled her up into the thin, pale gray awareness of the early morning and left her there, alert and useless, until the world decided to start. She had learned to be productive with it. She was in the corridor outside the communications room when the alert went out, close enough to hear the signal content before anyone had told her she should be listening. It was not a distress signal. She knew it the way she knew things, not through analysis, not immediately, but through the reading of it. The wrong rhythm. A genuine distress signal had a particular urgency to its structure, not panic necessarily, but compression. Information paired to the bone because you were in distress and time was the thing you had least of. This signal was detailed in a way that genuine distress signals never were. It had complete sentences. It had a narrative arc. It told a story. She pushed into the communications room. Vel, the overnight V-Thrani communications officer, was reaching for the alert escalation controls. "Wait," Marin said. Vel stopped, looked at her. "Authentication is valid." "I know. Look at the timestamp interval on the header." Vel looked. It took a moment. The interval was 0.3 seconds over protocol, not a number that any automated flag would catch, a number that required you to know the protocol precisely and to be looking for deviation. "That could be transmission drift," Vel said, not defensively. Carefully, doing what good communications officers do, which is not jumping to conclusions in either direction. "It could be, but the signal content is also wrong. It's too complete. Listen to the sentence structure." Marin pulled up the audio on a secondary screen and they listened together, a human corporal and a V-Thrani communications officer, standing close in a small room at 3:40, listening for the texture of something that was supposed to be in crisis and wasn't. If this escort responds to a false distress, it breaks formation, and a convoy with a gap in its escort formation. Vel's hand came away from the controls. They called Vethkalo. The regressives had planned it carefully. They had a detailed understanding of V-Thrani communications protocols and a detailed model of how human personnel would respond to a crisis signal. With urgency, with decisive action, with the speed that humans valued and that V-Thrani sometimes misread as recklessness. The plan required that human and V-Thrani personnel respond differently to the same crisis, pulling in separate directions, generating exactly the kind of confused, fractured, incompatible response that could be documented and presented to the council as evidence. What the plan did not account for was Marin Vaz standing in a corridor at 3:40 for reasons entirely unrelated to the plan, close enough to hear, attentive enough to notice. What it also did not account for was a mess hall that had spent 4 days figuring out how to sit together, a logistics team that had learned to speak plainly, a specialist who had started leaving the door open in his jokes, and a V-Thrani engineer who had walked through it, a communications officer and a corporal standing side by side at 3:40, listening for the thing that was wrong. The second false signal came at 5:40. By then, Garo had been pulled in to help Vel because Vel had asked. She'd asked because they'd had 3 meals together by then, and she knew he'd been trained on human comm protocols at his last posting, which was knowledge that was useful right now. He caught the second signal before the authentication even completed because he knew what to look for. He'd been taught what to look for. He'd been taught at 3:41 that morning by Marin, who had told him and Vel together what the pattern looked like. Because if there was one false signal, there would be more, and she wanted them both to be able to see it without her. The third came at 700. Navon caught it, because Marin had shown him the authentication interval deviation when he came on duty at 600, and he had the kind of mind that, once given a specific technical parameter, applied it automatically, and he flagged it 40 seconds after it arrived. 3 signals, 3 catches. Human and V-Thrani personnel, alternating. Each catch escalated through both chains of command simultaneously, formally documented, timestamped to the millisecond because Vel ran a rigorous shift log and Garo had learned to match that standard. By the time the convoy reached Duvark Tertius, they had a record. not of a crew that had fractured under pressure, not of a human Vithrani partnership revealing its fundamental incompatibilities in a crisis. A record of a mixed crew that had operated under active sabotage, in closer concert than either species had managed alone. A record of people who had, because of 11 days on a transport, learned to see what the other saw. The integration review was held in a chamber Marin had no civilian equivalent for, a large circular room with tiered seating, and a central floor that felt deliberately exposed, designed for observation from all sides, the kind of architecture that said everything done here is done in the open. The coalition's full council occupied the upper tiers. The regressive bloc sat together on the right, the pale gold eyes of their older members very still. Marin sat in the observer section at the back. She was the only corporal in the room. She suspected she was also, technically, the only heir to a 47,000-year-old bloodline, but that was not a distinction that showed on her uniform. Veth Kahlo presented the convoy documentation with the precision and the restraint of someone who is very angry and has decided to let the facts do the work that anger cannot. She did not editorialize. She presented the timestamps, the signal analyses, the authentication anomalies, the formal attestations, and the response record, which showed, with the clarity of numbers, who had caught what and when and how the information had moved, laterally, between human and Vithrani personnel, across the seams of the crew, without waiting to be instructed. The regressive bloc's lead spokesperson, a very old Vithrani whose face had the quality of something that had decided a long time ago and was no longer interested in reconsidering, attempted to frame the incidents differently. Human personnel had questioned signals that Vithrani protocols had already authenticated. Human personnel had introduced uncertainty into a system that required confidence. Human personnel noticed something wrong, Veth Kahlo said, and brought it to their Vithrani colleagues, immediately, without hesitation, and their Vithrani colleagues confirmed it and escalated it through both chains of command simultaneously, and caught the second and third incidents without human instruction because they had shared the relevant information across the crew. She paused. The chamber was very quiet. This is not a record of incompatibility. This is a record of what integration actually looks like, not in protocol, in practice. On a transport, at 3:40, with 11 days of accumulated trust between people who had learned to sit at the same table. Marin looked at her hands. She thought about 47,000 years, about 30 systems held together by people who did not think of themselves as historic, who thought of themselves as doing their work, who moved the table, who ran the inventory, who noticed the heating element and fixed it with a torque wrench. She thought about her grandmother's solar panels, her grandfather's water truck, her mother's equations, her father's blood, carrying something he never named, in a body that had eventually found its way home to a specific daughter in a specific room on a specific day, when a blood test should have taken 11 seconds, and instead crashed a system that had been searching for 47 years. She thought about what it meant to be the one who made the team function. Not the one who saved the day, the one who made it possible for the team to save itself. The vote was not unanimous. 7 members of the full council voted to begin revocation proceedings, the regressive bloc, holding their position with the solidity of people who had built their identity around it, and were not going to release it today regardless of what was presented to them. 7 votes. A minority that would not become a majority today, but would not disappear tomorrow either. The work that had been done on a transport was not a permanent resolution. It was one data point in a much longer argument. But the majority held. After the session ended, Orveth found her in the corridor outside the chamber. He was moving slowly, the movement of someone very old who has been sitting in a hard place for a long time. "The review is recorded," he said. "The convoy documentation is part of the permanent archive. I know what you did on that transport. I rearranged some seating arrangements, Marin said, and caught a timing error in a comm header at 3:40. Yes, he looked at her with those amber-going gold eyes for a long moment. That is precisely what the Ethavel does. She thought about this, and that's enough to hold a partnership together, moving tables and noticing a 0.3-second timestamp deviation. The Veil held 30 systems for 4,000 years, he said, before the last Ethavel died and the line dispersed. Not through force, not through grand political architecture, through accumulation. Small corrections consistently made, gaps noticed before they became fractures, misunderstandings addressed before they calcified into grievances. He pressed his fingers to his throat, gently this time, without the fear she had seen in Sewell's face in the medical bay, and without the grief she had heard in his own voice when he first confessed. Something different. Something close to what, in a Vithrani, she was beginning to understand was reverence. They did not think of it as history-making. I suspect they thought of it as ordinary work. Marin looked at the chamber doors. "My sergeant is going to want a full debrief," she said. "I know. Admiral Chen is going to want to discuss what this means for the structure of the joint program." "Yes, and there will be people from your diplomatic corps and from ours, and it will take a very long time and produce very thick documents. And I am still a corporal." Orvith made a sound that she now knew was the Vithrani equivalent of a smile, not quite laughter, not quite not laughter. "For the moment," he said. "The records indicate that the Ethavel and the Veil civilization held no formal rank either. Rank, in the end, is for people who need the symbol of authority to exercise it. The Ethavel generally found that unnecessary." "That's either very complimentary, or a very polite way of saying, 'I'll always be a corporal.'" "Perhaps both," he said, and the sound came again. The medical bay on Duvark Tertius was staffed by a Vithrani medic who had the same professional disinterest as Sewell, and different eyes, younger eyes, amber without any gold in them yet, the eyes of someone who has not been carrying things long enough for the color to change. The quarterly blood draw was standard procedure. Marin sat in the chair and rolled up her sleeve. The auto-injector clicked. She counted. 11 seconds. The terminal hummed its 4-note chord, all the way through without stuttering, without changing pitch. The screen showed its ordinary readout, health markers, biological flags, the routine business of a body accounted for and found in order. She rolled her sleeve back down. Her unit was in the corridor outside Price, Hawks, the others. She could hear Garo's voice rising in the particular way it rose when he was building to something, the timing she recognized, the breath before the landing. And then the laughter. His, and after a beat, 2 Vithrani voices joining it. She didn't know what the joke was about. It didn't matter. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the medical bay, in the chair, with the small mark fading on her arm. She had been carrying something in her blood for 47,000 years. A line that had gone from a civilization she would never know, across 8 species and 200 generations, and the specific improbable accident of her parents meeting in the particular way they had met, into a corporal on a joint posting who had spent her whole life doing the work without knowing what to call it. She had always been the one who moved tables. She had always been the one who fixed the heating element and ran the inventory and told people what the other side of the room was actually thinking and why. She had done it in every unit she had ever served in, with every person she had ever worked alongside, as far back as she could remember. She had just always thought of it as ordinary work. Maybe it was. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the most important work always looked ordinary from the inside, looked like noticing a thing and naming it, looked like a conversation in an equipment bay, looked like moving to a different table. Maybe 47,000 years of civilization building was just that, done consistently, by people who thought they were doing the small things and never knew they were the hinge. She stood up. Outside, the laughter was still going. Garo had followed the first joke with something else, and it had worked too, and now there was a conversation happening. She could hear the back-and-forth quality of it, question and answer and addition, the sound of people finding the shape of each other's humor. She went to where it was. She went because she always went to where people were, because the gaps didn't close themselves, because someone had to be the one to notice, and to move, and to stay, and that someone, in this posting and in the last one and in all the ones before, and apparently for 47,000 years before any of those, was her. The corridor held the sound of laughter, warm in the dim station light. She walked into it.